Hello and welcome to my video on how to plaster. This is a video that I've wanted to do for a while and I've now got the opportunity to do it. You might have seen my videos where I've plastered the kitchen and the bathroom and dry lined it all. Go and check those out if you haven't seen them yet. I briefly cover how to dry line on those videos and the processes that I've taken to get to where I am now. Now, plastering's a pretty tricky skill to master. I've been doing it about 7 years now and I still learn things every time I do it and ways to make it faster and more efficient. Chances are, if you're watching this video, you've probably got a bit of patching to do at home. Maybe there's some walls that are looking a bit tired and you're looking to replaster them. So you've probably found this video hoping that I can give you some guidance. And you are in the right place. I'm going to do my best to walk you through the equipment, materials and all the processes it takes to get a wall nice and flat. But bear in mind, I can teach you as best I can on this video, but you're not going to pick up a trowel and be perfect at it and get it right first time. It's obviously a skill that you have to develop over many years of practice, so don't expect perfect results first time, and it might need a bit of redoing or filler and touching up when you're finished. So we're going to get to it. We're going to cover the equipment and materials that you're going to need. We'll start here. We've got our primary weapon as it is, and that's the plastering trowel. They're best if they're made out of stainless steel. This is a Marshalltown, I can't remember, maybe 14 inch. It's stainless steel. That's really important because you're going to be getting it wet a lot and you don't want your trowel rusting at all. Cheaper trowels are often made out of carbon steel, which is basically a steel that's prone to rust. So when you start washing your trowel off, it'll begin to rust the next day. Preferably, the bigger the trowel, the better it is. That's basically because obviously when you're putting the plaster on the wall, you're making bumps in the wall, and the bigger the trowel is, the more bumps it can kind of take out at once. And it's a lot easier for getting over uneven surfaces because your trowel won't kind of angle into the dips as you're troweling it up. However, the con of that is, as a beginner, the bigger the trowel is, you will struggle to get plaster off your hawk and actually onto the wall. Pros and cons, I'd probably start off with a 12 inch. Next, we're moving on to the flexi trowel. This isn't entirely necessary. This is something you can purchase if you become a bit more experienced, or maybe you want to do a lot of plastering. Same thing, it's made out of a stainless steel. The difference is the blade on this is very flexible as opposed to our first trowel, which isn't really very flexible at all. The benefit of having this as a flexible trowel is the tension that's held in the steel when you apply pressure on it. So later on in the process, when it comes to getting it flat towards the end, these really come in handy in getting a good finish. Next on, we'll move on to the corner trowel. I haven't really looked after mine because I don't do a lot of wet corners. These are basically made for internal corners. So if you're doing two walls that are joining together in the corner, obviously you can run this down to kind of guide your corner into a decent shape without too much effort. The next tool is a bucket trowel. Unfortunately, the handle has snapped off mine. As you can see, it was only a cheap one, so I'm not surprised. But this is going to be used to get plaster out of your bucket, such as the name bucket trowel. A really key tool, you're going to need one of those. And then we'll move on to brushes. So towards the end of the process, you'll have to get your corners nice and neat. You'll need 2 brushes. You'll need one for cleaning off dirty tools and cleaning the bucket out. The wider the better usually, so I usually have a 4-inch masonry brush, but I've lost it, so I'm kind of settling for this one. It still does the job, just takes a bit longer. And the other brush, again, I usually have a nicer one, but I've lost it with the other one. This is going to be the brush that you use to make your corners nice. So this is going to be used, you'll usually wet this brush, and you'll brush away any of the bits of plaster that are on any adjoining surfaces. Next up is the mixer. I've got 240 volt one. It's basically a big motorized mixing paddle. It makes life a lot easier. It's got a big paddle on the end of it, which obviously you put in your plaster to mix it up, and that's going to spin round and round and get it all mixed to a decent consistency. Alternatively, if you're only doing little bits of plastering, or maybe you're patching or something, and you don't want to go and spend a load of money on a mixing paddle, you can pick these up. They're about, I saw one for about £8 in Wix and B&Q. They're basically mini mixing paddles. You can use them for all sorts of stuff like grouting and mortar, but they're really handy. They have like a hexagonal top on them, so they fit into a normal combi drill. So it's a great alternative if you don't want to splash out the money for a mixing paddle. You can just get one of these instead if you're only doing small amounts. The next thing is probably just as important as your trowel. So this is called your hawk. This is basically the platform in which your plaster sits on in your hand. So as you load your plaster up, it'll be sitting on here until you take it off with your trowel and put it on the wall. There's a whole variety of different hawks. Some are made of like a polyurethane foam. You get metal ones and these plastic ones, which I have. I would recommend the plastic one if you're getting one. They're slightly more durable because they've got a bit more flexibility to it. You can get metal ones, but the problem with those is as plaster dries on them, and you have to kind of break the layers of plaster off that build up over time, you can end up basically warping your hawk when you hit it to get the plaster off, which means that all the corners start bending, and then all of a sudden you've got a surface that isn't flat and it doesn't hold the plaster as well, and it makes it a whole lot more awkward. The benefit of having a plastic one is that these do actually flex a little bit. So over time, as the layers of plaster build up and you need to get rid of some of that weight and break it off, you can just flex all the corners, hit it with a hammer, and the plaster breaks off super easy. It's also worth getting one with a little foam pad on the bottom, like what I've got. That basically goes underneath your hand, so as you're taking the weight on your arm over the time of plastering, it's not going to ache your hand or start rubbing. And next up is the buckets. So you're going to want 3 altogether generally. I have one for like clean water, one for dirty water as it was. I use 1 bucket of water for basically rinsing the plaster off my tools and off the mixing paddle, and the other one's going to be used for the brush for creating clean edges on our walls. So 2 of those, and then you're going to want your actual mixing bucket. Some people use the big black flexi tubs or whatever colour they come in, purely because I think they're easy to clean out, but I've always used one of these. You can find them in most sort of builders merchants. They're basically plastering buckets. It's a rigid white plastic. I think they're about 30 litre capacity. You can get bigger ones, but obviously it's more expensive. And the last piece of equipment I use is a spray bottle. So at a point in the process of plastering, we have to apply some water to the wall. Some people prefer to use the brush method, where they'll dip their brush into the clean water, say. They'll either brush the brush on the wall to deposit the water, or I've seen people dip it in and actually flick the water on the wall. The problem I have with both of those is if you use the brush on the wall, it actually puts a texture on your wall, obviously, which means it's another mark you've got to get out with your trowel. So I don't understand why people do it. And the other method of obviously splashing on the wall, you end up with a ton of water on the floor, and it makes the site a lot messier because then all the plaster gets integrated into it and then it becomes a bit muddy. The good thing about using a spray bottle is you don't have to keep getting down and wetting your brush every time you want some water. It's obviously a pressurised container that you can pump up, and it sprays water out of it. So you literally have water anytime you need. And the good thing about this is you can control how much water you apply to the wall, which keeps the mess down. Another piece of equipment you may or may not need is a ladder or a hop up to get to the top of your wall or to your ceiling. You can find them again in most builders merchants. They're quite robust bits of kit. They're metal, generally metal. The legs click up, and it's basically a working platform, so these are really good for hard to reach areas. Okay, so moving on to materials then. Obviously we'll start with the key component, which is plaster. It's a whole rabbit hole to get into with plaster. There's that many different types for different things that do different jobs. However, me and a lot of other people prefer to use a multi-finish plaster. This is a plaster that's basically, as it says on the bag, for a wide range of common backgrounds. That includes plasterboard, existing plaster walls, and generally just most surfaces that you can plaster. This will accommodate to. Generally, plaster will come in 25 kilogram bags for health and safety reasons and manual handling. Each bag of this will cover 10 square meters at 2mm depth. Next on the list is scrim tape. So this stuff is a fiberglass mesh that will come on a roll. It's self-adhesive, which means you can stick it to things and you don't have to kind of aid the adhesion by soaking it in plaster first. In older properties, if you've smashed plaster off the walls and you've got to the corners, if you find like a string type material, it's actually Hessian, which is the predecessor to fiberglass scrim tape, and that stuff is not sticky at all, and you have to soak it in plaster to get it to stick, and then you get plaster on your hands and it's so messy. So self-adhesive fiberglass tape is definitely the way forward. So fiberglass tape is used on all joints and gaps where materials meet. So any cracks or joins in plasterboard, basically any surface on the wall that you're going to be plastering which has an air gap, such as the joints in these plasterboards, or you might have a crack down your wall, you're going to need to put this scrim tape over. It's really easy to use. You just kind of roll it off, cut it with a utility knife, just to trim it off, and yeah, pretty much it. And next we'll move on to the corner beads, also known as angle beads. So these are basically formed out of aluminium, and they're used to create the sharp corner finishes that you see on plaster. I did cover it in a previous video, which I'll put the link to. Basically they work like this. So you put the trim on your corner, and basically there's a little ridge on it, and that ridge there is to accommodate the depth of the plaster. Again, these are about 2mm deep, so they work with the plaster itself. And obviously once both sides are covered, it's only this little raised edge that shows. See if I can find an example. So here's a corner I've completed. As you can see, there's just the ridge of the corner bead left. If you're plastering an existing brick, sand and cement, or wall that's already plastered and you're going over it, this is a must. You will 100% need this. This is PVA, same stuff you used to have at school, where you used to put it all over your hands and peel it off. Maybe that was just me. But basically you use this to prime and seal the surface of plaster. So a quick bit of theory on how PVA works. Sorry if I'm going to bore some of you, but if you look at these surfaces underneath a microscope, especially a surface that's already plastered, or sand and cement, concrete, basically it's like a sponge, and as soon as you mix your plaster up, if you don't use PVA, when you put your plaster on the wall, that sponge or that surface will absorb all of the water out of your mix. Your plaster will dry super quick, as in probably about 10 seconds, and then it's going to crack and fall off. All PVA does is basically, because it's a glue, you water it down to, I think, 1:4 ratio usually, and you give it a couple of coats, and the PVA will basically block the pores in the wall, which means the water takes a lot longer to soak through in the wall, which gives you the proper time you need to actually finish the process of plastering. A bit on surface prep, it's important to recognise what background you're actually going to be plastering onto. For example, when I do this video, I'm going to be plastering onto a plasterboard wall. Now, plasterboard walls are basically made to be plastered straight onto. You're not meant to really prime the surface with anything. They're only made to have the scrim tape on the joints. However, I know that you're not all going to be plastering on plasterboard. Some of you may be plastering existing walls. For example, if I was to replaster over this is where I would use the PVA. So I would mix up the PVA in a 1:4 mixture. I'd probably give it about 2 coats, and then while the PVA is kind of tacky to the touch, so you're going to want to put your fingers on it and you'll kind of feel your fingers sticking to it a little bit. That's the prime time to basically mix up your plaster and apply it. Other people have different methods, different ways they like to do plastering. Some people use sponges and all sorts. I'm just showing you my way on how I do it. So a quick thing to note is whatever surface you're plastering, make sure that it's free of wallpaper. Do not plaster over wallpaper. Even if you can't be bothered to strip the wallpaper off and you think it'll be all right, it won't be all right, don't do it. The principle of plastering is the background always has to be stronger than whatever you're putting on top of it. Obviously, if you've got wallpaper on there and you're applying a wet mixture of plaster, the water's going to soak into the paper. Paper's going to come off the wall and take your plaster with it. So make sure your wall's stripped of paper and apply your PVA, apply 2 coats of PVA, and it'll be ready to go. Now, on that note of surface prep, you might not always have wallpaper on your wall. I know some of you might have a painted wall which you want to go over, which is fine. If you've got a matte finish paint, i.e. there's no sheen on it, you can go ahead and just PVA on top of it and you'll be good to go. However, I'll just show you quickly because I have silk paint in my house. On this room that we haven't done yet. So silk paint is basically a sealed surface. Remember what I said about the sponge and water can't absorb into it. Now, the critical difference is if you've got silk paint and you can see a reflection on it, it's generally not a good surface to plaster just yet. And this is because, like I said, how PVA kind of blocks some of those holes on the sponge. Silk paint is completely sealed, which means that your plaster has nothing to sit on, which means your plaster has nothing to actually stick to, because if you imagine trying to plaster onto glass, you'd think it wouldn't really stick, it would just slide down the glass. The same thing happens to walls that have got a sealed surface. So if it's got silk paint, there's an extra step you have to take, and that's in the form of creating a mechanical key. You can do this quite easily with a product like this. This is Thistle Bondit. It's quite expensive stuff, but you can get cheaper stuff under the name of Blue Grit. It's a mix of PVA, but it has sand inside of it. So as you mix it up, you basically apply it onto the wall with a roller. The PVA inside of it will stick to your silk paint, and then the aggregate and the sand that's in it will then stick in that PVA. So you actually have like a rough surface for your plaster to sit on, and it won't come off the wall. To summarise that then, in case some of you got a bit lost, if you've got plasterboard, you don't need to do any prep whatsoever. You just need to scrim tape all your joints where the boards connect, either to other walls or the joints themselves. And if you're plastering over existing plaster or like a matte paint, you just need to apply 2 coats of PVA, so it'll be watered down to 1 mix of PVA to 3 parts water. You're going to want to put 2 coats on that, and then when it's a bit tacky to the touch, then you can mix up your plaster and apply it to the wall. And finally, if you've got silk paint or any glossy surfaces, you're going to want to prepare that by using a product such as Thistle Bondit or Blue Grit, and that's going to give the wall a mechanical key for your plaster to stick to. We're going to move on to mixing up now. So you're going to want to fill your 2 black buckets up with water. Generally about 3/4 of the way is what I use. And then your 30-litre plasterer's bucket needs to be about halfway full per 1 bag of plaster. that you're mixing up. So once your plaster's mixed up and your surface is prepped, you're going to want to get that plaster on your hook and on the wall. You can use your bucket trowel to scoop it out of the bucket and deposit it on your hook and then put it on the wall. Or if, like me, you've been doing it for years or you want to save your back, you can use something like this, which is known as a spot and stand. It's basically just 2 trestles with a square piece of wood on top. This holds the plaster, so all you need to do when it's mixed up, you put the mix on this table and you can basically scoop it off the table onto your hook. And the benefits of that is it saves your back a lot of aching. Obviously, if you're dipping down and getting plaster out of the bucket every time, it takes a bit of a toll on your back. So if you're going to be doing a lot of plastering, something like this goes a long way at protecting your back. When it's all mixed and you're ready to go, you're going to wet all of your tools and saturate them with water. The reason we wet tools prior to using them is because if they are dry, if you put your plaster straight onto your hook and it's dry, the plaster that comes into contact with the hook first is going to dry instantly because the moisture is going to be pulled out of it. And then you're going to be left with like a really tough sort of powdery texture on the bottom, and that's going to make it really difficult to get the plaster off your hook, and you'll have to clean your hook off and redo it. So mix up your plaster, wet all your tools, which is the process known as priming. So your plaster's mixed, your tools are ready to go, and now it's time to actually plaster the wall. So I'm going to show you how I plaster, and I do that in 6 steps. I'm going to walk you through each step. So step 1 is going to be your first coat of plaster, also known as your priming coat, or as I call it, the priming coat. This is basically the first coat that's going to hit your walls, so it's going to get rid of all the little lumps and bumps, fill in all the gaps. And this is a coat that's not made to be perfect, so it doesn't have to be too perfect when you're putting it on. Don't spend too much time trying to get it as flat as you can. Just concentrate on getting it on the wall, covering the wall as fast as you can. So the way you want to apply plaster is with a technique of up and down rather than side to side or going in all different directions. The reason for this is because if you want a uniform finish on your wall, it makes sense to put it on in a uniform way. I see a lot of plasterers and they just put it on all different directions, and the problem with that is it creates lumps in all sorts of places that you don't want them because the plaster gathers in certain areas. If you stick to one technique, just going up and down, start at the top half of the wall and work your way across. If you're left-handed, you want to start off at the right-hand side of the wall and work to the left. If you're right-handed, you want to start off at the left-hand side of the wall and work to the right. The reason for this is because the back of your trowel always leaves a line. So by working from the opposite side away from the back of the trowel, you're taking that line out every time you move over. So work up and down, start from one side to the other, do the top half, then the bottom half. With your step 1, once you've covered the wall with plaster, you're going to want to do a process known as flattening. So if you imagine you've been putting the plaster on in an up and down motion, flattening goes side to side, so it goes horizontally across your wall. This is basically a process just to get a lot of the lumps and bumps and any places where a lot of plaster might have gathered on the wall. And this basically just flattens it out. So you're going to want to go across the wall side to side, from left to right, right to left. Try and keep it in lines and try and keep it all straight. Again, don't worry about getting any massive lumps and bumps out because we're going to be applying a second coat on top of this. So step 2 then is the same as step 1. You're going to do another mix of plaster and you're going to put it on exactly the same as you did on top of your first coat. So this layer of plaster that you're putting on now, it's going to basically be more than you need to finish the wall. The reason for that is because as you trowel the wall up later on, plaster ends up coming off the wall as you take out the bumps. So basically you put on more plaster now than you're going to need, and then as you trowel it up, that excess plaster will be pulled off the wall and you'll be left with your flat surface. Again, get it as flat as you can, but don't worry too much about getting it perfect. So just put it on exactly the same as you did your first coat. And then once that's all done, wash off all your tools in one of your buckets of water. and then use that bucket of water to rinse your tools in future as you're going to need it. Now you've got your 2 layers of plaster on the wall and your tools are clean, you're going to want to move on to step 3. Step 3 is called your first trowel. So this doesn't require any more plaster. You're going to want to keep to the same motion that you've been doing to put your plaster on the wall, in an up and down motion and moving from one side of the wall to the other, doing the top half first, then the bottom half. Use your trowel and apply some slight pressure to get out a lot of the lines that you've got in there and a lot of the excess plaster that's sticking up. It takes a lot of practice. Don't get too caught up on getting every single line out, but you want to concentrate on getting most of the lines and the excess bits of plaster off the wall. And you'll notice your trowel will actually start to gather plaster on the edge that you're using to flatten it off with. It's important that you don't let that build up and scrape it off once you've done about 4 or 5 runs with the trowel. If you don't scrape it off, then you won't be removing any plaster off the wall and you'll just be shifting about a load of excess plaster that you don't need. So concentrate on just putting some slight pressure on the wall, going in an up and down motion. Don't let the plaster build up on your trowel and get out probably 50% of the lines that are on the wall at the moment. Once step 3 is done and you've done your first trowel, go ahead and get your brush. Wet it, so make sure you put lots of water on it, and then brush in all the edges where your new plaster's touching all the other walls, so you don't get like a build-up of dry plaster around the edges of your walls and you have nice neat corners. Once your corners are brushed, if you're working on a wall with the skirting board off, go ahead and get your trowel and cut the bottom of the plaster off the wall. This is essential and makes a huge difference, because if the joiner comes to put skirting boards on the wall, you'll find that the natural motion of your trowel creates a kind of ramp at the bottom of the wall, and you can imagine trying to put skirting boards on a wall that isn't straight is a right nightmare, and it upsets the joiner who wants to put his skirting board on. So if you actually cut the bottom of your wall off, you get bonus points with the joiner and makes your finish look a whole lot better. And that leads us on to step 4. So step 4 is exactly the same as step 3, the same as your first trowel, except you're going to be adding water to it. So go ahead and get your spray bottle, and you're going to want to apply a small amount of water to the area that you're troweling. So enough so it's kind of like a mist on top of the plaster. And you're going to be troweling it exactly the same as you've just done in step 3, just taking even more of those lines out now, and you need to apply slightly more pressure, because you'll find at this stage the plaster's gone slightly harder and it's a bit tougher to move around. If you start doing this and you find your walls quite dry, you need to speed up, because it means you've left it too long. If you start doing this process and a lot of plaster is coming back off the wall, it means you've done it too early and you need to wait for the plaster to stiffen up a little bit. Now, as you're troweling in your up and down motion, you'll find that the plaster that's coming off onto your trowel needs to be cleaned off a lot more regular. The reason for this is because the plaster that you're taking off the wall and leaving on your trowel, when you apply water to it, the plaster is actually a bit stiffer than the plaster on the wall, so you get an effect known as tiger stripes, and these are an absolute nightmare if you're in a room where the sun shines on the wall that you're doing, and this is due to just not keeping your tools clean as you're working. So make sure you keep cleaning them off and keep rinsing them with water to stop this happening. And that leads us on to step 5. So once you've done your wet trowel, you're going to want to leave your plaster until it's gone pretty much dry to the touch or pretty stiff to the touch. This step is known as a wet cross. Do you remember step 1 where you applied the plaster and then you've done a process known as flattening? Well, that's pretty much what your wet cross is. You're going to want to spray a mist coat onto your plaster. It's important at this stage that a lot of pressure is applied to the wall. This is going to be your final chance to get any last marks or dips out of the wall. This is where those flexible steel trowels really come into their own, because they hold a lot of tension in the blades. Pressure you apply goes a lot further and does a lot more. If you haven't got a flexible steel trowel, don't worry, you can still do it with the normal trowel that you've been using. You just have to apply a lot more pressure. You're going to want to work from left to right again. Keep your trowel angled slightly towards the direction you're going, probably about 30 degrees. If you keep your trowel completely upright, you can't put as much pressure on the wall, but you'll find if you angle it forward, you can apply a lot more pressure to the wall and you get better results. So start at the top, apply your mist coat of water. Keep the wall really wet at this point, so make sure wherever you're troweling, you've got water covering that area. That's going to help lubricate the trowel going across the wall, and it won't pull your plaster back off. Work your way down and you'll find the water will run to the bottom of the trowel, so you're essentially working the water from the top of the wall to the bottom of the wall, applying a lot of pressure, and you'll find that this will take quite a lot of the marks out of the wall if you've got any left. Once that's done, you're going to want to leave your wall for another 10 minutes maybe, depending on how fast it's drying. And you're going to want to do what I call the final trowel. So that's basically exactly the same as what you've just done, but you don't have to wet the wall, you just have to wet your trowel. Don't put as much pressure on, so only go across it lightly. And again, you're going to want to go from left to right, applying a light pressure and work the water to the bottom of the wall. And this is going to basically take out any little particles of plaster that are kind of sitting on top of the wall that you've missed. You can repeat this last step as many times as you wish. When you're at step 5, at the part where you've got to cross the wall, it's really important that you put a lot of pressure into the cross. This is going to get out a lot of the lumps and bumps that have solidified in the plaster as it's been going off. So the key to this step is put a lot of water on the wall. Don't soak it, but enough so your trowel's going to move easily. And then put a lot of pressure on your trowel through the wrist and keep your trowel at an angle and you'll be fine. And like with all these steps, when you're putting plaster on the wall, whether you're cross troweling it, whatever you're doing, make sure you don't keep your trowel too steep on the wall, so it's going to be scraping plaster off, and don't keep it too flat, because what can happen is you can catch the edge in the direction you're going and the trowel will stick to the wall and it'll chip all your plaster off. So keep it at a relatively shallow angle to the wall so that you can spread things easily. Not too steep that it'll scrape, but again not too flat that you're going to keep catching both your edges. And a lot of it is about pressure, so at the start when the plaster's still wet and quite soft, you want to apply less pressure, and as you go on through the steps you want to apply more and more pressure, and remember to keep your trowel clean of all the plaster that comes off the wall. So I'll usually repeat step 6 a couple of times while it's drying out. The drier it gets, the flatter and more polished the surface gets. So if you're still finding there's a couple of wet lines in there after step 6, let it dry a little bit and then go back over it with a little bit of water afterward. Once you're happy enough, go back over the wall with your brush and brush all your corners in where the plaster's onto the adjoining surfaces, and go around with your trowel and just scrape up any plaster that's fell on the floor at the bottom of the wall, and it'll leave your wall with a nice clean finish.